Hi, my name is Sven, welcome back to the channel. I hope you're doing great, and let's get started with today's episode on the HDR Global Wheel and linear gain. Among the various tools DaVinci Resolve offers for grading images, there are some that focus on creatively manipulating light, and others that focus on mimicking photometric behavior. Tools like offset and gain, as well as the HDR Global Wheel for example, use rather simple math to stay in the realms of naturally perceptual adjustments. With so-called linear gain, you can adjust exposure and white balance very similarly to how a camera sensor does. And because the HDR Global Wheel was kind of invented for the same task, we should take a look at how both techniques are different and which of the two might be better suited for certain situations. First, we have to understand what the term linear means. In real life, light behaves what we call linearly, meaning when you double a light source with 200 watts to 400 watts, it appears double as bright. If you increase a light source of 50 watts to 250 watts, it appears 5 times as bright. The same is true for adjusting the camera. Opening the aperture by 1 stop, so doubling the incoming light, is the same thing as multiplying the ISO by 2. Apart from the differences in blur and the amount of noise, both images appear pretty much identical. This comes with one disadvantage for digital images though. Bright areas in an image can reach really high values, while dark areas consist of very low values. For that reason, camera manufacturers started encoding the entire linear range into a logarithmic format. This way the image can be put into the range of 0 to 1 without cutting away detail. Adjusting the color of this log image with standard grading tools like lift, gamma and gain, however, now screws up the linearity of the original image, which is why the HDR palette was invented and why we can also use so-called linear gain as an alternative. In order for the tools to work accurately, we need to set up our color management correctly. It doesn't matter if you work with RCM, ACES or in your own node-based workflow, it is important though to tag the timeline color space. And while this is done automatically in color managed projects, you have to do this manually if you use YRGB unmanaged. For more information about this topic, please check out the video linked above. Also note that throughout the entire video we have to make sure that Luma Mix is set to 0 when we use linear gain, and I'll talk about this in a minute. The HDR wheels allow colorists to adjust individual zones, dark, shadow and light, and control saturation and exposure independently. This level of granularity makes it perfect for HDR projects that require detailed tone mapping and precision, but is also quite helpful for SDR projects. The HDR Global Wheel is the broadest of those controls and adjusts the exposure across the entire image. It is designed in a way to mimic photometric exposure of a camera, and if we compare this to changing the aperture, the only difference we can see is the amount of blur we get from opening the lens and the noise. It is essentially the same thing as adjusting the ISO. However, and we will see that in a minute, this is only true for brightness, not for color. Since gain is just a simple multiplication, we are able to scale light values up or down just the same way as in the real world, if we work in a linear color space, also called scene linear. For that, we use either a CST to convert from log to lin and back again afterwards, or use the simpler approach of setting our node color space to linear. This creates a CST sandwich on its own with 2 advantages. Less nodes and no extra tone mapping that we would have to disable manually with the CST OFX. Note that this only works correctly if our timeline color space is tagged correctly, and more about that in the video linked above. Let's compare what both techniques do. In this first example we boost the global wheel by 1 stop. Now let's reset this and boost the linear gain instead. As we can see, both images are identical. Let's do the same thing with -1 stop and +3 stops, which would be times 0.5 and times 8. So far, both tools result in the same images. But now let's have a quick look at adjusting color with them. Here we have a clip with the white balance way off. Let's correct this with the linear gain and the global wheel. As you can see, there are differences between the two. Since this clip was shot in B-RAW, we can actually compare both techniques to adjusting the white balance settings in our camera raw. Okay, now we match the perceived temperature, and as you can see with linear gain we are actually pretty close to the raw settings. The HDR Global Wheel on the other side seems a bit off. Especially if we look at the vector scope, there's a noticeable shift in the colors, somewhat similar to adjusting the hue shift slider. And by the way, if we tried to white balance this shot with the temp and tint in the HDR palette, we would actually get the same hue shift. And this is because the entire HDR palette works in a color space that is first of all unknown to us, and secondly different from the primaries of our project and source color space. As we just saw, linear gain comes with the great benefit that we don't change gamuts, which by the way, we can if we want to, and therefore it doesn't introduce hue shifts by accident. One disadvantage with linear gain, however, is that it takes a second to set up gain to work linearly, and also all the tools in this node now feel completely different and can produce artifacts easily. As I said earlier, we have to make sure LumaMix is at 0 when working with linear gain. But why is that? LumaMix is a tool in Resolve that compensates for luminance differences that come from color adjustments. It is designed for color values between 0 and 1 in order to work properly. When we work in linear, values can far exceed that range and reach heights of 50 or 100 or even more. The compensation therefore goes wild and can create really nasty artifacts that are hard to fix afterwards. For that reason, we should disable LumaMix here by setting it to 0 and, if necessary, compensate for brightness differences manually by just boosting or lowering the gain. With the HDR Global Wheel, there's no extra time needed for setting it up. Granted, all of our color management settings are set up beforehand. It works for simple exposure adjustments right off the bat. Personally, I don't really like this hue shift, and therefore I never really do color adjustments in the HDR palette. And also, if you push the color balance quite far, the extra color conversions inside the tool can result in clipping colors. One side note about linear gain, however, I don't know if you noticed, but earlier when we compared both tools, we were able to just type in -1, +1 and +3 in the HDR Global Wheel, while for the linear gain we had to type in 0.05, 2 and 8. You can see how those numbers can be hard to work with, and that's simply because of the math behind it. But this is just one benefit of the HDR Global Wheel. Whether you turn it up or down feels the same in regards to how many turns you do. For linear gain, the more you turn it down, the more sensitive it gets. And if you increase it, it gets finer and finer, so big moves like boosting +3 or +4 stops of exposure feel impossible to achieve. Of course, if you work with raw footage, the best option would be to roughly balance the colors there. But both techniques, linear gain and HDR Global Wheel, are incredibly useful when you don't have access to raw settings with the footage. And if you think about grading as shaping light in a photometric way, it is only logical to use tools that are as close to the real physics as possible. That doesn't mean you have to only use linear gain from now on. But for the technical sides of grading, meaning balancing a shot, matching individual clips to each other, and even creating vignettes that feel realistic, doing operations in a scene linear environment just makes the most sense and creates the most natural looking results. So hopefully you could see how grading with these tools can improve your color grading and how both the linear gain and the HDR Global Wheel are useful for setting exposure. After all, it comes down to which one you prefer, and that's the beauty in DaVinci Resolve. There's always multiple tools to choose from. I personally use linear gain way more often than the HDR Global Wheel, but that of course also depends on the job. So let me know if you have any more questions about grading with scene linear tools, and if you want to help out the channel, please consider subscribing and liking the video, and until then, I will see you in the next episode.